Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we've got something really intriguing to dive into. Before we get started, grab a drink, sit back and relax. Don't forget to drop a like and hit that subscribe button. It really helps us out. And in the comments, tell us what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from. Now, let's get into the video. As the shadow of the Black Death swept across the European continent in the mid-14th century, it did not offer mercy or reprieve. The disease travelled not only through fleas and rats that thrived amid the squalor of cities, but also through trade routes and human contact. It was a relentless invader, a force of nature indifferent to social status or wealth. To truly understand why survival was such a distant hope, one must immerse themselves in the grim realities of life during that era. Imagine a town crowded beyond what any modern city might tolerate. Houses pressed tightly together, made of timber and thatch, with narrow streets clogged by people, animals, and refuse. Sanitation was nearly non-existent. Waste was thrown into the streets or open gutters. The stench was unbearable and an invisible invitation to disease. Rats flourished under these conditions, stealthy companions of the Black Death, carrying fleas infected with Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the plague. This bacterium did not choose its hosts with kindness or discrimination. Flea bites introduced the plague into the bloodstream, which could then manifest in several deadly forms. The first and most common was the bubonic plague. Swollen lymph nodes or buboes appeared under the arms, in the groin, or on the neck. These would become painful and inflamed. Once symptoms emerged, death often followed within days. The septicemic form was even more merciless. It spread within the blood, causing bleeding, tissue necrosis, and almost certain death before anyone could seek help. The pneumonic plague was the most terrifying of all because it attacked the lungs and could spread directly from person to person via respiratory droplets. After infection, symptoms manifested in coughing, chest pain, and bloody sputum, and death would come rapidly. At the time, people had no understanding of bacteria or infectious disease transmission. The prevailing medical theories were based on imbalances of bodily humours, astrology, and divine punishment. Physicians attempted treatments that now seem cruel or useless. Bloodletting, ingestion of toxic substances, and exorcisms were common. Masks with beak-like structures were worn, filled with herbs and spices. These did nothing to prevent the inhalation of infectious droplets, but reflect the desperation to shield from some unseen menace. Crowded and filthy conditions made every interaction hazardous. Entire families could fall ill within days, and with so many victims, care would often be left to chance. Those who survived often fought off the infection by mere luck, or possibly some semi-effective immune response. Yet such immunity was not widespread or guaranteed. No antibiotics existed at that time. The disease could rage unchecked. The plague's impact extended beyond the physical toll, penetrating society's very fabric and creating an atmosphere of fear and despair. Religious institutions, once bastions of hope and sanctuary, were overwhelmed by death and often blamed for failures to protect the population. Social norms broke down as mass mortality left communities bereft and economy systems in chaos. Workforces dwindled and fields went untended, leading to famine and further misery. Moreover, the speed of the disease's spread was staggering. Towns just days away from each other could be decimated in turn. Travellers coming from infected areas unknowingly carried the disease home. Quarantine measures were rudimentary and often ignored or ineffective. Cities tried to close gates and enforce isolation, but the microscopic enemy flouted such barriers. The planners of the time did not appreciate airborne transmission or the role of rats and fleas. Public health infrastructure as understood today did not exist. The notion of personal hygiene was scant, with bathing regarded suspiciously or only occasionally practiced. Clothing was rarely washed, meaning bacteria and fleas remained close to their human hosts. This perpetuated the cycle of infection relentlessly. During outbreaks, fear itself could act as a secondary contagion, People would abandon the sick or flee cities, unknowingly spreading the plague further. Some populations resorted to violence against perceived scapegoats or those believed to have brought the disease. This only fragmented communities when unity was most desperately needed. Religious euphemisms like the wrath of God offered no practical guidance on prevention or cure, only fatalism. Surviving the plague also demanded more than avoiding infection. It required access to enough food and safe shelter to maintain strength should the disease strike. But famine followed in many regions after harvests were left abandoned due to labor shortages and fleeing peasants. Cracks appeared everywhere, food was scarce, and disease thrived in conditions of malnutrition and exhaustion. In essence, anyone living through a major plague outbreak faced a perfect storm of conditions aligned against survival. A microscopic bacillus hitchhiking on fleas nested among rats. Crowded, unhygienic living conditions magnified transmission. An utterly uninformed medical system placed faith in ancient remedies and rituals rather than real cures. Societal collapse spread with the disease itself as panic, misinformation, and death sapped community resilience. It is within this brutal, merciless context that the common individual had to endure the plague. There was no vaccine, no medicine, no reliable way to predict who would succumb and who would survive. The odds were stacked overwhelmingly against the average person. Yet the plague did eventually subside, not because of human ingenuity, but largely due to the depletion of susceptible hosts. Those who survived likely had some level of natural resistance or simply avoided exposure. Over time, this changed the genetic landscape of affected populations. But returning to the mid-1300s, survival was an almost unimaginable challenge. 1 in 3 people across Europe are estimated to have died during the Black Death. Entire families vanished overnight. Villages emptied and cities became ghostly ruins. The sheer scale of death rippled for decades, influencing every aspect of life. To this day, the plague remains a stark reminder of vulnerability when humanity faces a foe beyond comprehension. It forces one to appreciate the advances in science, medicine, and public health infrastructure so often taken for granted now. The conditions that made the medieval plague a death sentence are overwhelmingly absent in the modern world because of centuries of progress. What would it mean to live back then when simply walking outside was potentially fatal? Why would you not survive? Because everything was stacked against you from every angle. The struggle against the plague was not just about fighting an illness, it was a battle against ignorance, fear, and the breakdown of society itself. No story about the Black Death can be separated from the reality that from the first fevered cough to the final breath, survival was a razor-thin and uncertain event. And so begins the tale of why you would not survive a medieval plague. In the next part, we will explore the specific mechanics of how the plague bacteria moved invisibly through medieval towns and the physiological destruction that it caused within the human body. Understanding these microscopic assassins helps explain why medieval citizens found no escape and how modern knowledge finally unraveled their deadly mysteries. But first, consider this. Every element of medieval life, from hygiene to housing to medical belief systems, unknowingly conspired to feed the relentless hunger of the plague. Next, we will zoom into the microscopic battlefield within the body where Yersinia pestis wages war. We will uncover how the bacteria evade the immune system and cause their devastating symptoms. This is where the true horror lies, hidden beneath the surface of swollen buboes and blackened flesh. Only by grasping this invisible war can the futility of medieval defenses be fully understood. To imagine surviving the Black Death is to imagine evading a killer that could strike your family, your village, and your world with ruthless precision. It is to glimpse a world where every breath, every touch, and every moment could be your last. And from that brutal reality, the resilience of human survival takes on profound meaning. There is no simple answer to why someone would survive while others perished. It was not a matter of strength, piety, or fate alone. It was the cruel randomness of biology combined with the unforgiving environment of medieval life. In times before antibiotics and germ theory, suffering reigned unchecked. This is why no one was safe and why surviving a medieval plague was one of the greatest challenges ever faced by humanity. As we move deeper into this story, we will learn what the plague looked like on a biological level, how it spread so rapidly despite attempts at containment, and perhaps most importantly, how it forever changed the course of history by decimating populations and reshaping societies. The tale of the plague is not just a medical one, but a story of human lives caught in the jaws of an unseen predator. It is about the fragility of civilization when confronted by nature's deadliest microscopic agents, and about the inventions and discoveries that ultimately turn the tide. The next part of this series will open the door to those invisible killers, the bacterial invaders in a bloodstream and lungs, revealing the science behind the centuries-old scourge. Understanding their strategy helps explain why medieval people stood no chance as the plague swept through their towns and countryside with terrifying speed and lethality. Stay with this journey because every detail calls us to appreciate both the horror faced and the triumph won through knowledge. Because to survive a medieval plague is not just to evade death, but to witness the transformation of human understanding through the most devastating trial imaginable. You would not survive because everything surrounding you formed a perfect storm of contagion, fear, ignorance, and physical peril. To grasp the enormity of that is to realize how far we have come and how precious modern advances truly are. The medieval plague was a force of nature, a biological tsunami that uprooted life as known then. To emerge from its wave was to defy odds stacked impossibly high. But that story will be told soon, so stay ready to delve further into the unseen microscopic war that made the medieval plague so utterly lethal. The plague was not merely an illness, it was a force of nature, a relentless wave of death that swept through villages, towns, and cities with terrifying speed and ruthless efficiency. The medieval world was utterly unprepared. The very fabric of society frayed as the disease tore through communities. Those living in cramped, poorly ventilated homes had no reprieve. Sanitation was almost non-existent. Waste was often dumped in the streets or near wells that provided drinking water. Fleas thrived on rats that infested these same spaces. This created the perfect storm for an infection waiting to happen. Imagine waking in the morning to find a swollen, painful lump under your armpit or on your neck. The lump, known as a bubo, would grow quickly, turning red and black as it filled with pus. These buboes were the signature sign of bubonic plague. But behind this external horror lurked something far worse. Fever would rise rapidly and uncontrollably, chills would rack the body, and the pulse would grow weak. Headaches and delirium soon followed. Many who contracted the disease would perish within days. In the cramped, noisy buildings of medieval towns, it was impossible to isolate the sick. Their fevered coughing could fill entire streets with droplets carrying the deadly bacteria. Fleas carrying the plague jumped from rat to rat and then to humans. When a rat died, its fleas sought out new, warm bodies to feed on. If one flea found you, it could inject you with Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind the plague. Medical understanding of the time was primitive. Disease was often attributed to miasma or bad air. Doctors wore strange masks with long beaks stuffed with aromatic herbs in an attempt to filter this corrupt vapor. Yet this did nothing to stop the tiny organisms causing the infection. Treatments were ineffective and often made matters worse. Bloodletting was common, weakening the already sick. Herbal concoctions provided little relief. Quarantine was not widely practiced or enforced. When it was haphazard, and often ignored because people needed to work and survive. The social structure itself collapsed under the weight of the plague. Entire families vanished within days, leaving behind empty homes and abandoned fields. Trade routes became lines of death, merchants spreading the disease unknowingly from one town to another. The economy, already fragile, seemed on the verge of complete collapse. Workers and peasants were decimated. Those who survived found themselves in the ruins of a world they once knew. Religious institutions were overwhelmed. Clergy attempted to provide solace, but could do little to explain why so many perished. Some saw the plague as divine punishment. Processions randomly made their way through streets in hopes of appeasing what they believed was an angry god. Yet these rituals offered no protection. The dead outnumbered the living in some regions by the thousands. Cities struggled to bury their dead. Mass graves were dug hastily. The stench of decay filled the air. The sheer volume of corpses attracted scavenging animals and further spread the fleas that carried death. In some places, bodies were burned publicly in a desperate attempt to cleanse the land. Family members often had to watch helplessly as their loved ones were taken away for burial, sometimes never to be found again. The plague did not discriminate entirely, but it found the weak easily. Children, the elderly, and those sick with other illnesses succumbed rapidly. Malnutrition, common in many medieval communities, left immune systems weakened and less able to fight off the infection. Living conditions in castles and among the nobility sometimes offered better protection but not immunity. The court was not spared even when it retreated to the countryside. The psychological impact was profound. Fear was a constant companion. People stopped socializing, markets emptied, and villagers deserted their homes. Suspicion and paranoia grew. Some targeted minorities, blaming outsiders or groups they feared. This increased misery and violence added fuel to an already grim ordeal. Medical practices of the day reflected a desperate ignorance rather than knowledge. Treatments ranged from the bizarre to the brutal. Many patients were prescribed poultices made from rotten meat or herbs smeared on buboes. Others were subjected to purging or forced vomiting. These remedies often exacerbated dehydration and weakness. Despite the horror, some individuals did survive. Their resistance was believed to be either luck or divine favor. Modern science suggests that genetic factors might have played a role in survival. Certain people produced proteins that killed the bacteria or mounted a stronger immune response. Over time, as the plague recurred in waves throughout Europe, survivors sometimes passed on their partial immunity to future generations, slowly reducing the devastation the disease could cause. However, during any single outbreak, survival was never guaranteed. As the plague spread, it reshaped the world on a grand scale. Labor shortages due to mass death changed economic relationships. Serfs and peasants found they could demand better wages or conditions because workers were scarce. This dynamic set the stage for the end of feudalism in many regions, yet none of these long-term consequences mattered to those struggling to breathe through their final fevered hours. The appearance of the plague was also a catalyst for advancements in public health, although these changes came painfully and much too late for many victims. Quarantine measures began to be systematized after officials noticed that isolated ships or villages sometimes escaped infection. Cities started to establish rudimentary sanitation protocols. They burned clothes and bedding of the sick to kill fleas. These early efforts planted the seeds for future understanding of contagion. Despite chaos and tragedy, the human spirit persisted. Survivors rebuilt communities and reclaimed empty fields, stories of loss and endurance passed down through generations. But the question remains stark and chilling: why wouldn't you survive a medieval plague? The answer lies in the merciless combination of environmental conditions, biological vectors, lack of medical knowledge, and social disintegration. Each of these elements alone posed a challenge. Together, they formed an unstoppable storm. In the unrelenting face of this disease, those who lived during the medieval period were extraordinarily vulnerable. The plague was not a battle fought merely with medicine or courage. It was a catastrophic event that laid bare the limitations of an era. It disrupted normalcy, shattered families, and killed millions. The vacuum it left in its wake transformed societies and shaped history in profound ways. But no amount of prayer, superstition, or folk remedy could stop the invisible enemy in those days. It was a time when the very air you breathed could bring death, and that is why you wouldn't survive a medieval plague. The grim reality of surviving a medieval plague went far beyond the terrifying sight of sores and fever. It was a battle against an invisible enemy that preyed on every weakness in human society at the time. Medical knowledge was rudimentary. Doctors had little understanding of what caused the plague or how it spread. Treatments were often brutal and ineffective. At best, they offered fleeting relief. At worst, they hastened death. Plague victims were left to suffer in close quarters with their families, neighbours, or even strangers. Rats infested the cramped, unsanitary cities where people huddled together. These rats were not harmless pests. They carried fleas. Fleas were the true vectors of the disease, feeding on infected rats and then jumping onto humans to transmit the deadly bacteria. The bacterium, Yersinia pestis, was responsible. It moved quickly. Once bitten by an infected flea, a person could fall ill within days. The bacteria multiplied in the bloodstream and lymph nodes, causing the terrifying swollen buboes that gave one form of the plague its name. Knowledge about sanitation was primitive at best. People had no idea how to halt the spread of disease. Streets were filled with waste and trash. Chamber pots were often emptied directly onto the streets. Water supplies were contaminated. This created a fertile environment for the bacteria to thrive. It also gave fleas easy access to human hosts. Family members who cared for the sick were almost certain to contract the disease themselves. Isolation was a concept rarely understood. If a neighbor fell ill, the infection would easily jump to the next door. Communities burned quickly once touched by the plague. The range of symptoms varied, depending on which form of the plague a person caught. The bubonic plague was most common. Victims developed fever, chills, headaches, and extreme weakness. The hallmark buboes appeared first as painful swellings in the armpits, groin, or neck. These became blackened and necrotic in many cases. Death came swiftly within a week for most who contracted this form. There was also the pneumonic plague. This variant infected the lungs, turning the victim into a walking source of contagious bacteria. A cough spat out infectious droplets. This form was almost always fatal and spread rapidly through crowded conditions. It caused respiratory failure and suffocation. There was a third, rarer form known as septicemic plague. It infected the bloodstream directly. This version often caused death before any symptoms appeared. Victims would collapse suddenly. Internal bleeding would cause purplish or black blotches on the skin. The disease overwhelmed the body so quickly that there was no time to respond. The speed with which the plague killed was one of the most terrifying aspects. A person could be healthy and vibrant one day and dead the next. Surviving required a combination of luck and isolation. The incubation period of just a few days meant that disease could spread faster than anyone realized. The cramped, unsanitary living conditions made avoiding infection nearly impossible. When the plague struck a village, it often wiped out half or more of the population in a matter of weeks. Entire households disappeared beneath the weight of death. Graveyards filled beyond capacity. Bodies were sometimes piled in pits or hastily covered with earth. These mass burials only made things worse by attracting more rats and fleas. Efforts to escape plague-ridden cities meant little. The disease travelled along trade routes and on merchant ships. Fleas and rats did not respect borders or quarantines. Sometimes fleeing only spread the problem to new areas, turning a local outbreak into a regional or even continental catastrophe. Even ruling classes were not spared. Nobles, clergy, and kings fell victim to the plague in their fortified castles and grand cathedrals. There was no social immunity. Medieval people tried many desperate methods to protect themselves. Some wore amulets or charms. Many relied on religious faith, invoking saints or divine punishment. Others attempted boiling water, steaming their homes, or fumigating clothes with herbs. None of these approaches had any real effect on the bacteria or the fleas responsible for transmission. In some ways, their greatest weapon was avoiding contact with others who showed signs of sickness, though this was difficult to implement consistently. Once the plague was inside a household, it became a death sentence for many. Traditional care practices involved close contact. Family members cleaned sores, washed the sick, and stayed nearby for days on end. Each act of kindness increased the risk of infection. The sick became so weak they could no longer fend for themselves. Food and water brought to them became potential carriers of disease. Even the mourners at funerals could contract the plague from the bodies of loved ones. The sheer scale of death from the medieval plagues destabilized societies. Labor shortages threw agriculture and craftsmanship into chaos. Fields went untended. Food production dropped. Starvation followed. Fear, grief, and superstition led to social unrest. Minority groups were frequently scapegoated. Entire communities were blamed for the spread of the disease. Violence and persecution became additional plagues alongside the bacteria. In medical terms, the concept of contagion itself was barely understood. The miasma theory prevailed. People believed that poisonous vapors or bad air caused the plague. This led to misguided measures like burning incense or carrying fragrant flowers. While some of these practices may have helped mask odors or even repel flies, they did nothing to stop flea bites or treat the infection itself. Bloodletting and purging were common medical interventions intended to balance bodily humours, but they only weakened the sick further. What made the medieval plague especially deadly was the lack of effective treatments, coupled with the rapid and aggressive nature of the disease. Starving fleas, rat infestations, the close quarters of urban life, and incomplete hygiene formed a perfect storm. When mass death struck, there was no time to plan or respond effectively. Societies were overwhelmed, collapsing under pressure, while the plague continued its merciless course. Imagine living in a time where the very fabric of daily life was torn apart by invisible microbes, where neighbours vanished without warning, where the sound of a funeral bell was a constant reminder that the plague could strike again any moment, where hope flickered weakly against a backdrop of suffering and despair. The medieval plague shaped history not only through the millions who died, but by altering the course of human development. It influenced art, religion, economics, and social structures deeply. Yet beneath those sweeping changes was the stark reality of human vulnerability. In such a world, survival was not merely a matter of will or strength, but a cruel roll of the dice. The bacterial enemy showed no mercy. It exploited every weakness. It thrived on fear and ignorance as much as on flesh. To face the medieval plague was to confront a natural horror as relentless as war or famine. The odds of survival were grim. Every symptom signaled a step closer to death. Every moment carried the risk of infection. Every interaction could be the last. That is why you would not survive a medieval plague. It was a triumph of biology over hope, and a testament to how far humanity must travel before conquering ancient enemies hidden in the smallest creatures. The shadows of those pandemics still echo today. They remind us of the fragile thread keeping disease at bay and the importance of knowledge in the ongoing battle against our microscopic foes. The medieval plague was not just a chapter in history, but a chilling lesson in the vulnerability embedded deep in human existence. The medieval plague was not merely a disease. It was a relentless force that tore apart the fabric of society. In the crowded towns and muddy villages, it spread without mercy. People could do nothing but watch as neighbor after neighbor succumbed to the mysterious affliction. The terrifying speed at which the plague moved left no time for understanding or proper care. It was an invisible killer lurking beneath everyday life. It is difficult to fully grasp the horror when reading about it today. The world was an entirely different place. Medicine was primitive. Germ theory was centuries away. Most believed that disease was a punishment from God or the result of miasma or bad air. This meant people had no idea how the plague truly spread. They clung to ineffective remedies and rituals that offered no protection. Hospitals were overwhelmed and often turned into places of death rather than healing. Quarantine was still a new and barely enforced concept in many locations. Isolation seemed impossible amid the chaos of urban life. Living conditions contributed greatly. Homes were small and shared by large families. Streets were filthy drains. Waste poured openly into the lanes and rivers. Poor hygiene created a breeding ground for fleas and rats, the primary carriers of the bacterium, Yersinia pestis, the culprit behind bubonic plague. These fleas lived on rats that swarmed through homes and markets. When an infected rat died, the fleas would seek a new host, often a human. Once the flea bit a person, the bacteria multiplied rapidly near the bite site. Painful swollen lymph nodes known as buboes would develop. High fever, chills, and delirium followed swiftly. Death often arrived within days. The physical torment was unbearable, but the psychological terror was even worse. People saw loved ones days before in good health and then suddenly found them writhing in agony. The body's weakening caused bleeding and vomiting. Survivors were rare. Entire families vanished. The panic and despair fractured communities. Some fled their homes only to spread the plague further. Others barricaded themselves inside to escape the creeping sickness. Isolation led to despair, but it was also a desperate attempt at survival. Doctors and clergy battled their own fear. They approached patients draped in crude protective gear that offered little real defense. The beak-like masks some wore were stuffed with aromatic herbs that were believed to purify the air. In reality, these outfits did little to prevent flea bites or close contact with infected individuals. Treatments were often barbaric by modern standards. Bloodletting and purging were common, even though they weakened the patient. Some used toxic substances in the hope of curing the disease. Others resorted to prayer and relics seeking divine intervention. None stopped the plague. Communities tried containment, but without understanding how the disease spread, they struggled. Walls were built to isolate infected quarters. Yet rats and fleas moved freely. Trade and travel were restricted, but smuggling and secret passageways undermined efforts. Fear bred superstition. Jews and other minorities were scapegoated and brutalized, accused of poisoning wells or cursing towns. Violence sometimes erupted as communities sought someone to blame. These acts did nothing but deepen the social wounds. Beyond the immediate devastation, the plague reshaped the medieval world in profound ways. Labor shortages gave surviving workers newfound leverage to demand better pay and conditions. This shift slowly eroded feudalism. The massive death toll shook the religious certainties of the time. Some lost faith while others became more devout or sought radical reforms. Art, literature, and culture reflected the pervasive presence of death and suffering. The Black Death became a symbol of humanity's vulnerability. Despite these long-term consequences, it is crucial to remember that most people had little time or energy for reflection in the midst of the epidemic. Daily life was a desperate struggle. Simply avoiding the illness was a feat beyond the ability of many. The pale swelling of the buboes masked a terrible truth. Medieval society was utterly unprepared to face such a crisis. In that context, it becomes painfully clear why surviving a medieval plague was incredibly unlikely. No one could guarantee safety. No doctor or healer had effective remedies. No social institution could provide reliable protection. The very nature of the living environment invited the disease in. Fleas and rats thrived on human neglect and filth. The lack of knowledge about germs left people vulnerable to their own misguided attempts to escape the plague. With so little understanding of how to fight it and few practical means of self-defense, the odds were stacked overwhelmingly against survival. Even those who managed to avoid catching the plague faced tremendous challenges. The collapse of communities meant food shortages, economic instability, and social disorder. Widows and orphans were left without support networks. The constant exposure to death eroded mental health across society. Fear and grief bordered on unbearable, and in many cases relatives were forced to handle the burial of the dead without proper rituals or reverence. Mass graves replaced individual burials to contain the spread. These sites added to the grim atmosphere of hopelessness. Survival hinged on many factors outside a person's control. Proximity to infected areas mattered. Access to clean living spaces and food sources mattered. Even simple luck played a role. Some people may have benefited unknowingly from natural immunity or lesser exposure, but these were exceptions rather than the rule. The plague was a thunderstorm that swept indiscriminately, ravaging the innocent and the guilty alike. Imagine the unbearable sound of a village where every home is silent, except for the groans of the sick and the curses of the dying. Visualize markets turning ghost towns as people retreat in terror. Picture priests overwhelmed by the sheer volume of the dead requiring last rites and burial. Consider the relentless odor of decay and unwashed bodies hanging heavy in the summer air. These were the realities for millions who lived through the medieval plague. Behind the horror was a fundamental biological truth. Yersinia pestis was a highly efficient killer once it reached a human host. The flea bite provided a direct pathway for the bacteria into the bloodstream. The immune system, unfamiliar with the pathogen, was overwhelmed. Internal hemorrhaging, shock, and organ failure followed. Without antibiotics or supportive care, survival chances were minuscule. Until the 20th century, plague remained a deadly threat wherever rats and fleas existed in proximity to people. The sheer scale of the mortality is almost unfathomable today. In some regions, the plague wiped out as much as half the population. Entire towns vanished, leaving empty houses and abandoned farms. The demographic collapse altered the political and economic landscape. Power shifted as survivors seized new opportunities amidst the ruins. Yet for those alive at the time, none of this was consolation. Daily existence was a nightmare that seemed to have no end. What further compounds the tragedy is the human response steeped in ignorance and superstition. The blame placed on outsiders fueled divisions. The ineffective treatments prolonged suffering. Communities broke down under the strain. Against this backdrop, the modern understanding of how disease is spread would have been a beacon of hope. Yet in medieval times it was completely absent. In light of all this, it is clear why the medieval plague was a death sentence for so many. The convergence of biological lethality, poor living conditions, absence of medical knowledge, and social turmoil created an environment where survival was the exception. The past cannot be changed, but understanding this nightmare offers insight into the fragility of life and the importance of science and reason in combating disease. Looking back, it seems miraculous that any souls endured. Their survival came not from deliberate action or effective care, but often from sheer chance amid a landscape scarred by loss and despair. The plague was an entity far beyond human control. It was a reminder how vulnerable humanity once was. As the Black Death ebbed only to recur later in waves, the lessons remained hard-won. Medieval society carried the scars of the plague for generations. It forced a reckoning of many long-held beliefs. It ushered in change even if painfully slow. But none of this mattered much to those in the throes of the disease. For them, survival was not a certainty. It was a desperate hope, sometimes realized and most often denied. Contemplating this evokes a somber respect for the resilience required just to endure those dark years. The medieval plague was a monstrous force of nature. It was indifferent to prayers or pleas. It was an unstoppable shadow that followed people relentlessly. This brutal reality means that in that time and place, a typical person faced almost insurmountable odds just to live. The medieval plague remains a stark reminder of how easily a deadly disease can overwhelm societies lacking the tools to understand and fight it. In our modern era, advances in medicine, public health, and sanitation shield us from such catastrophes. Yet history warns us never to be complacent. For every plague past, history cautions vigilance for plagues future. The nightmare that was the medieval plague should never be forgotten. It is a testament to human vulnerability and the preciousness of survival. Who among us today would truly withstand such an ordeal? The answer is a haunting no one knows for certain, yet the facts are undeniable. The medieval plague was a force against which the human spirit was battered severely. Without knowledge, without medicine, without hope beyond faith and superstition, survival was doubtful at best. This harsh truth compels reflection. It strengthens appreciation for the progress made against disease. It deepens empathy for those who suffered when every breath could be a final one. It challenges modern viewers to remember the fragility that once defined the human condition. If you imagine wandering medieval streets during a plague outbreak, you are not stepping into a simple historical drama. You are walking amid a living nightmare where death was a neighbor, a shadow, an unyielding spectre closing in. In such times, to survive was to defy the natural order. It was triumph against overwhelming odds. This understanding brings the tale of the medieval plague beyond dates and names. It turns it into a human story of suffering, loss, and the elusive hope clinging to life even in the darkest moments. It allows modern minds a glimpse into a world where survival was never guaranteed and every day was a struggle against a deadly unknown. Such is the legacy of the medieval plague. It was a grim chapter that shaped history with wrenching pain and indelible change. Knowing why you would not survive that plague means recognizing the limits humanity faced long ago. It also means honoring those who did survive, not as heroes, but as quiet witnesses to one of the greatest calamities in history. The medieval plague stripped life to its barest essence. It confronted people with their mortality in shocking and brutal ways. It transformed entire continents by rearranging population, economy, and belief. It marked the end of an era while laying seeds for a new one. Grasping the true nature of that terrifying time challenges us to appreciate the power of knowledge. It reminds us of the importance of overcoming fear with science. It teaches lessons about community, resilience, and the costs of ignorance. The plague story is both a warning and a memorial. It is a shadow that lingers over the medieval past, impossible to ignore. The plagues claimed millions and left echoes in art, literature, and collective memory. Yet beneath that shadow lies the story of people who faced it fearfully, hopelessly, but sometimes surviving against all odds. As history looks back, it does not soften the brutality of those years. Instead, it illuminates the profound human ordeal behind mere numbers. It shows the medieval plague not only as a disease, but as a shaping force that carved deep marks into the world. To truly understand why survival was so unlikely is to confront the full weight of medieval vulnerability. It is to see history in visceral terms. It is to honor human endurance amid catastrophe. This story is far more than cold fact or distant tale. It lives in the spaces between death and life where ordinary people once struggled to breathe one more day in the shadow of relentless plague. This grim truth is the story of why you would not survive a medieval plague. The world of the medieval plague was one deeply hostile to the fragile human body. It was an environment shaped by ignorance of disease, absence of effective medicine, and a swirl of superstition and fear that only intensified the terror of those unforgiving years. To understand why survival was so rare, it is essential to peel back the layers of how people lived, how the plague operated, and how every circumstance stacked the odds against any chance of enduring its onslaught. At the heart of the devastation stood a bacterium named Yersinia pestis. It was a microscopic predator, invisible to the naked eye, but powerful enough to alter the course of history. This tiny organism thrived in fleas that infested the black rats common in medieval towns and cities. It moved with ruthless efficiency, hitching rides on these fleas and spreading through close human contact, as well as through the air, especially in its pneumonic form when it infected the lungs. Once the bacterium entered the human body, it set off a sequence of symptoms that would come to be dreaded across the known world. Contagion moved swiftly. A flea bite delivered Yersinia pestis into the bloodstream, where the bacterium travelled to the lymph nodes. Here, it multiplied rapidly, causing them to swell into painful, tender buboes that gave one form of the disease its infamous name, bubonic plague. The swelling was not merely a mark of infection, but a sign of the body's struggle. The immune system, lacking the sophisticated weapons of modern medicine, mounted a desperate defense that often resulted in fever, chills, and debilitating weakness. Without intervention, the infection progressed. Blood vessels and vital organs became sites of bacterial invasion, leading to septicemia, the presence of bacteria in the bloodstream. At this stage, the disease was almost always fatal. The pneumonic variety of the plague was far deadlier. When the lungs were infected, the disease gained the ability to spread through respiratory droplets. A single cough from an infected person could launch thousands of infectious particles into the air. Close contact with others ensured that this airborne disease spread like wildfire through crowded marketplaces, households, and hospitals. It killed with terrifying speed. Symptoms like severe coughing, bleeding from the lungs, and extreme respiratory distress emerged, and death would often follow within days. No medicine existed to cure it, and the infection's rapid course made survival a rare prize. Living conditions in the medieval era only magnified the risk. Towns were densely packed. Homes lacked running water and sanitation. Waste frequently piled up in streets or drains that ran alongside dwellings. This created an environment where rats thrived. Fleas infesting these rats had easy access to human blood. The constant proximity between humans and rodents, combined with the squalor of urban centres, created perfect conditions for plague outbreaks to ignite and survive. The knowledge of disease transmission was primitive. Miasma, or bad air, was the common explanation for illness. People believed that foul smells could carry sickness. This was not entirely wrong, as bad sanitation coincided with disease, but it failed to recognize the true vectors, the fleas and rats, or the invisible bacteria. Measures intended to block miasma, such as fumigations or offered prayers, had no effect on halting the actual spread of the plague. People carried on with their lives and rituals, unknowingly walking into deadly traps. Additionally, medieval medicine was grossly inadequate against such a formidable foe. Physicians relied heavily on ancient texts and theories like the balance of the humours. Treatments included bloodletting to release bad humours, herbal concoctions, and rituals that today seem more harmful than helpful. The tools used were often sharpened knives, leeches, or purges, none of which addressed the bacterial cause. Even quarantine measures, when attempted, were inconsistent and often came too late. Some towns tried to isolate the sick, but without understanding how the disease spread, infected fleas and rats still entered communities. The plague was relentless. Fear and social upheaval compounded the challenge of survival. plague outbreaks often sparked panic and mass flight, which unintentionally spread the disease to new locations. People abandoned the sick and buried their dead hurriedly, sometimes tossing bodies into mass graves or rivers. Entire villages could be wiped out in weeks. The breakdown of social order meant that communities lost their ability to care for the vulnerable. Starvation and exhaustion weakened many even before the disease struck. Survival became not a question of individual strength, but a matter of being in the right place at the right time, and sometimes sheer luck. It is also important to note the role of nutrition and general health. Medieval people suffered frequent food shortages and famine. Poor diet impaired immune function. Those already sick with other diseases or malnourished stood little chance. The human body, exhausted and deprived, was more susceptible to the plague's deadly grasp. Even those who escaped the disease often faced secondary infections and complications that left lasting scars. The psychological impact exacted a silent toll. As death hovered over every household, stress and despair infected minds and hearts. Survivors sometimes suffered breakdowns or extreme withdrawal. In some cultures, the failure to understand the disease's causes gave rise to scapegoating. Entire groups of minorities, such as Jews or foreigners, were blamed and violently persecuted. This shattered communities and further weakened social cohesion when unity might have offered some hope. Medieval plague outbreaks were periodic, punctuated by waves that swept across Europe, Asia, and parts of Africa. Each cycle brought fresh devastation and a dramatic reduction in population. In some cities, more than half of the inhabitants perished within a single plague outbreak. Entire regions became ghost towns. The loss of so many skilled workers, farmers, and tradespeople crippled economies and disrupted trade networks for years. The ripple effects of these demographic calamities are still studied today. Despite all this darkness, it was not impossible to survive. Some individuals carried genetic traits that made them less susceptible. Others simply escaped exposure. Quarantine measures, however primitive, sometimes slowed transmission. Clerics and healers, though powerless to cure, provided comfort and aided in care. But these exceptions were rare. The reality was brutal. Survival was the exception, not the rule. The plague fundamentally reshaped medieval society. Towns would eventually clean their streets. Public health measures emerged slowly. Knowledge grew incrementally. Cities built walls and gates to isolate themselves during outbreaks. Trade routes became more cautious in spreading contagion. For centuries, people grappled with the legacy of these devastating events, reshaping cultural, economic, and religious dimensions of life. In conclusion, the medieval plague was unlike any danger faced by people before or since. It was a biological storm of unimaginable force, amplified by social, environmental, and medical vulnerabilities. To live through it required much more than courage or faith. It required an understanding of disease that did not exist, conditions vastly different from the cramped and filthy medieval towns, and a degree of luck that could scarce be granted amid such suffering. Without modern antibiotics, sanitation systems, and public health knowledge, death loomed large for nearly every soul caught in its grasp. To imagine surviving that plague is to imagine a world where hope flickered against overwhelming darkness. This chapter of history is a solemn reminder not only of human fragility, but also the enduring quest for knowledge and resilience that would come in later centuries to change the fate of humanity. The plague's advance was relentless and indiscriminate. It seeped into every corner of human existence where conditions allowed it to flourish. Medieval cities were death traps in this regard. Narrow, winding streets choked with refuse and filth became the perfect breeding grounds for rats and fleas, the primary vehicles of the bacterium responsible for the Black Death. The unsanitary reality of urban life made it almost impossible to escape. Open sewers ran alongside houses, spilling waste into public walking areas. Water sources were contaminated and often little more than stagnant pools. Disease did not hesitate to exploit the lack of hygiene that was commonplace at the time. It is essential to understand that the people living through the plague had little to no concept of germs or how diseases spread. The idea that invisible agents could carry illness was alien to the medieval mind. Instead, explanations leaned heavily on superstition, divine punishment, and miasma, the belief that foul, corrupted air caused sickness. This misunderstanding of the nature of disease transmission meant that preventative measures were largely ineffective or misguided. People did not wash their hands or clean their homes in ways that could have slowed the spread. They avoided the sick out of fear rather than reason, sometimes abandoning infected family members altogether. Hospitals of the period were not the safe havens of healing as they are today. Many were overcrowded, lacked skilled medical personnel, and had limited means to provide effective care. What care was available often involved rudimentary practices that may have worsened a patient's condition. Bloodletting, the use of toxic herbs, and invasive procedures without anesthesia were common treatments. In reality, the Black Death's victims needed quarantine and cleanliness, the very things medieval hospitals failed to deliver. Instead, these places often became hotspots for further infection and despair. The symptoms of plague were harrowing. Shortly after infection, high fever would set in, followed by the swelling of lymph nodes into what were called buboes. These tumours could grow to the size of an apple or even an orange and were intensely painful. The skin around them turned black due to internal bleeding, feeding the image that the victim was literally rotting from within. In many cases, the disease progressed to septicemic or pneumonic forms, where the bacterium entered the bloodstream or lungs. At this stage, death could come in a matter of hours, often with horrifying physical signs such as vomiting blood or severe respiratory distress. These gruesome symptoms struck terror into the hearts of witnesses and survivors alike. Families lived in constant dread of the plague's arrival. If someone fell ill, there was often no hope of survival. Those who cared for the sick risked infection themselves, further spreading the contagion. Entire villages or towns could be wiped out within weeks. The social fabric tore apart as the fear of death eclipsed all else. Trade faltered, farms were abandoned, and communities lost faith in both science and religion. The plague was not just a medical catastrophe, it was a profound social and psychological upheaval that reshaped medieval life in irreversible ways. One of the grim ironies was that the methods of disposing of the dead were inadequate and sometimes contributed to the problem. Mass graves were dug rapidly to contain the overwhelming numbers of corpses. These graves, sometimes shallow or located too close to inhabited areas, became further sources of infection. The stench and the body's decomposition released new waves of miasma according to contemporary belief, compounding the terror. People were unable to conduct proper burials, which had deep cultural and religious significance, intensifying the emotional toll. The dead were cast aside as if mere refuse, stripping dignity even in death. The impact on the workforce was devastating. With such a massive population decline, fields went untilled and skilled craftspeople disappeared. This sudden labour shortage disrupted the agricultural and economic systems that sustained medieval society. Yet it also opened new social dynamics. Survivors found increased bargaining power and opportunities as they competed for scarce labour. Although the plague inflicted immense suffering, it inadvertently challenged existing feudal structures and set the stage for eventual social shifts in Europe. However, this transformation did not mitigate the immediate horrors experienced during the plague years. The plague also exposed the limitations of medieval medicine and knowledge. Physicians lacked effective treatments, not due to lack of care, but because the understanding of infectious diseases was rudimentary at best. treatments aimed at balancing the body's humors as theorized by ancient medical authorities were fundamentally flawed. Remedies involving herbs, amulets, or bleeding were more ceremonial than therapeutic. Attempts to isolate patients were hampered by ignorance and social resistance. The scale and speed of the Black Death overwhelmed any medical practice of the time, reinforcing the perception of helplessness in the face of the invisible enemy. Fear and superstition fueled social unrest. Scapegoats were common as communities sought explanations for their suffering. Minority groups, such as Jewish populations, were tragically blamed and persecuted, accused of poisoning wells or invoking the plague through dark magic. These baseless accusations led to violent pogroms, further destabilizing society. The social paranoia was another layer of devastation, where human cruelty paralleled the devastation wrought by disease. It underscored how, beyond the biological threat, fear could fracture human bonds and lead to senseless violence. How different would it have been if the knowledge of bacteria, fleas' role in transmission, and effective sanitation methods had been available? The plague's toll might have been mitigated significantly. Quarantine measures could have been implemented with real understanding of their importance. Medical care could have focused on symptom relief and infection control. Instead, humanity was caught in a dark fog of ignorance, superstition, and desperation. This lack of understanding meant that survival in the face of a medieval plague was a matter more of fortune than skill. In examining why anyone would struggle to survive such an ordeal, it becomes clear that biology, environment, society, and knowledge, or the lack thereof, all converged in a lethal confluence. The plague was a biological scourge intensified by the conditions of medieval life. From the helplessness of infected individuals to the collapse of entire communities, the medieval plague is a stark example of how a microscopic organism could change the course of history. Its lessons, though learned at great cost, illuminate the vital importance of science, sanitation, and social responsibility in managing disease. Beyond the immediate terror, the medieval plague revealed the fragility of human societies in the face of disease. It showed how an interconnected world, even in the 14th century, could become a conduit for tragedy when ignorance met a powerful pathogen. Travel and trade routes unwittingly became plague corridors, carrying death far beyond its initial outbreak. The medieval population's inability to respond with effective measures ensured that survival was the exception, not the rule. The plague's shadow stretches across centuries, reminding us of vulnerabilities that persist when knowledge is absent or ignored. It also challenges any modern perspectives that see advanced medicine and hygiene as guarantees against catastrophe. The medieval plague demands respect for the deadly harmony of human environment and microbial ecology. It is a sobering story of how an empire of illness flourished amid human frailty and limited understanding. Today, with the benefits of modern science, antibiotics, and public health systems, the plague is no longer the unstoppable force it once was. Yet the memories of those harrowing years continue to serve as warnings. They remind us why the slightest lapse in vigilance can resurrect fears of pandemics. They teach the importance of infrastructure, education, and compassion in the face of disease. The medieval plague was not just a historical event, it was a cruel tutor from which humanity continues to learn, sometimes the hard way. Looking back at those times, one must confront the terrifying reality that for most people, surviving a medieval plague would have been nearly impossible. The microscopic enemy had the advantage of stealth, overwhelming numbers, and a human world ill-prepared to resist it. The plague transformed life and death itself into a lottery of chance, a grim reminder of vulnerability in a world without antibiotics, vaccines, or public health knowledge. It was a battle humankind lost on multiple fronts for decades. The The lessons etched into history by the medieval plague are deeply woven into human consciousness. They urge us to appreciate advancements in science and medicine. They compel recognition of the social conditions that influence disease spread. They point to the crucial role of accurate knowledge and timely action in saving lives. Ultimately, the reason you wouldn't survive a medieval plague lies not only in the brutality of the disease, but in the stark absence of tools and understanding we take for granted today. This convergence of microbial power, human condition, and societal realities made the Black Death an unparalleled catastrophe. It decimated populations, altered economies, upheaved religions, and transformed cultures. To survive was rare, and to witness death on such a scale was to live amid a profound crisis. The plague was a dark chapter that tested humanity's endurance and resilience to its fullest. In the end, it remains a powerful reminder of how far we have come and how precarious survival can be when those advances are absent. The stench in the streets was unbearable. Human waste flowed freely in open gutters. Rats scurried among the piles of refuse. Crowded homes trapped families indoors with no way to escape the invisible menace creeping through the air and blood. There was no concept of germ theory or understanding that an organism far too small to see had invaded every corner of the land. Instead, people grasped for explanations by looking for signs or omens. Some blamed the alignment of stars, others blamed evil spirits or divine punishment. Nothing they did could stop the invisible enemy from claiming victim after victim. In towns and villages, the plague advanced like an unstoppable force. The defining symptom was the sudden onset of fever. Within hours, the infected would feel chills and aches. Painful swellings, called buboes, appeared in the groin, neck, or armpit. These lumps were swollen lymph nodes filled with infected fluid and a mass of bacteria. The buboes sometimes turned black or dark purple as tissue around them died. Blood filled under the skin as small hemorrhages brought forth the names we remember. The Black Death, the Great Pestilence, terms now synonymous with death on a vast scale. Once symptoms began, the chance of survival dropped dramatically. The bubonic plague itself was grim. Some who survived this form escaped with terrible scars. But the plague's deadliest form was pneumonic plague, which infected the lungs. At this stage, coughing spread droplets loaded with plague bacteria throughout enclosed spaces. One person coughing near an uninfected individual could doom them without any other contact. Pneumonic plague moved fast and killed faster still. Days or hours might pass before breath ceased entirely. The fever raged and the lungs filled with fluid. Victims staggered and gasped, often choking on blood. There were no treatments to stop this downward spiral. Hospitals offered no sanctuary. Their crowded halls became breeding grounds for disease. Lacking antibiotics, the staff could do little except tend to symptoms and pray. In truth, the notion of a hospital as a place of healing was alien. These were often rudimentary charitable establishments run by religious orders. Care rather than cure defined their mission. When plague struck, no visitor entered. Infected patients were often locked within their rooms or placed into quarantine. But quarantine was as much a curse as protection. Isolation rooms turned to death chambers where prisoners were left alone to cough and bleed in torment. Few understood the role of rats and fleas that carried the plague's bacteria. Fleas feeding on the blood of infected rats became vectors themselves. Fleas would jump onto humans seeking a new meal. Their bite delivered Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the plague. Once inside the human bloodstream, the bacteria rapidly multiplied. The immune system was overwhelmed before it could mount an effective defense. This microscopic warfare played out beneath the skin no one could see, but felt with brutal certainty. The population density of medieval Europe further accelerated the plague's deadly path. Cities grew crowded. Narrow streets funneled people into wards with shared water sources and public latrines. Sanitation was non-existent by modern standards. Food markets bustled without safety regulations. People lived, worked, and died in close quarters. Fleas and rats thrived in these conditions. When plague struck a city, entire neighborhoods were wiped out within weeks. Bodies piled up faster than graves could be dug. Mass burials filled trenches on the outskirts of towns. Fear spread as fast as infection, stirring paranoia and breaking social bonds. In the countryside, the impact was no less devastating. While villages were smaller, they lacked hospitals or advanced care. Many were dependent on subsistence farming. As peasants fell ill and died, fields went untended. Harvests failed. Starvation stalked alongside plague. The collapse of agricultural production fed a vicious cycle, weakening immune systems and leaving survivors vulnerable to secondary infections. Clerics and priests held a complicated role as plague ravaged communities. They were expected to provide comfort and administer last rites. Yet the risk to themselves was immense. Many clergy died alongside their flocks. Some abandoned their duties in fear. Others persisted, knowing their presence was one of the few remaining links to hope and tradition. Mass funerals became the norm. Churches overflowed with the dead. The ringing of bells marked the passing of yet another soul taken by the plague's unyielding hand. The social consequences of the plague reached far beyond immediate mortality. With such a significant portion of the population lost, economies shattered. Labor shortages gave surviving peasants unprecedented leverage to demand better wages or serfdom conditions. Traditional hierarchies weakened. Landowners struggled to manage estates with fewer hands. The resulting social upheaval helped propel changes that would shape Europe's transition out of the medieval era. But these transformations came at the cost of unimaginable suffering. Medical knowledge was rudimentary at best. Physicians relied on ancient texts that mixed observation with superstition. Treatments ranged from bloodletting to the application of pungent herbs thought to drive out evil. Many cures were little more than desperation cloaked in ritual. The plague's rapid progression left no time for gradual recovery or adjustment. Pain and delirium consumed the dying. Families would watch helplessly as loved ones succumbed to swollen nodes, fevers, and respiratory collapse in days or hours. The inefficacy of medical efforts added to the terror that gripped the living. Isolation measures and attempts at cleansing the environment were haphazard at best. Some cities closed gates and forbid foreigners entry. Others mandated the wearing of special masks or clothing by physicians and attendants. These efforts had limited impact. The true vectors were invisible. The people who enforced quarantines lacked understanding of contamination routes. Often rejected by society, plague survivors who recovered became objects of suspicion or scapegoats. Fear overwhelmed compassion, eroding community bonds. Art and literature from this dark period reflect an intense grappling with mortality and divine judgment. The motif of the danse macabre, the dance of death, emerged as a grim reminder that no one escaped fate. Nobles, clergy, peasants, all were united in death's shadow. Painted images showed skeletons leading all walks of life in a final circle. The cultural impact of the plague resonated for centuries thereafter. It cast a long shadow over European consciousness. Comparisons to modern pandemics invite reflection on how much was lost in knowledge and infrastructure at the time. With antibiotics and vaccines today, plague is no longer the unstoppable predator it once was. Still, the memory of the medieval episodes remains a stark lesson. When a lethal pathogen meets a vulnerable population lacking scientific understanding or social measures, devastation can be swift and total. Even the efforts of those few who sought to understand and contain the plague fell far short. Paracelsus, centuries later, proposed ideas linking disease to external causes. Girolamo Fracastoro suggested contagion through invisible particles. Yet, in the Middle Ages, such concepts had barely taken hold. Lacking microscopes or bacteriology, doctors were blind to the true culprit. Treatment remained in the realm of guesswork, prayer, and fear. Wherever the plague struck, death was inevitable for many. The sufferer's body became a battlefield as bacteria multiplied and cells were destroyed. The immune system's fevered response sometimes caused collateral damage in organs and tissues. Pneumonia filled the lungs with fluid, suffocating victims. Blood seeped from mucous membranes in the terminal stages. Families were torn apart, sometimes unable to bury the dead properly. The psychological trauma echoed down generations. Medieval cities, those centers of commerce and culture, were often the worst affected. The increased movement of people and goods, including rats that harbored fleas, helped spread plague across trade routes. The disease followed merchants, pilgrims, and armies. By the mid-14th century, the Black Death spread along the Silk Road and shipping lanes from Asia to Europe. Ports became entry points. As infected fleas moved downstream through population centers, entire regions were decimated within months. In sum, surviving the medieval plague was a near impossibility for most. The combination of lacking scientific understanding, densely packed populations, and absent effective treatments created a perfect storm. The speed at which symptoms emerged and advanced left no room for intervention. Isolation, quarantine, and rudimentary sanitation efforts could slow, but never halt the march of death. Without effective medicine, warnings, or prevention, people lived in terror and despair as the plague claimed up to half of some populations. These realities shaped medieval society fundamentally. Recovery took decades. The losses disrupted economies, governments, and cultures. The trauma influenced art, religion, and philosophy. It laid bare humanity's vulnerabilities before nature and invisible threats. The plague became a grim, indelible chapter of history, one that acts as a haunting reminder of how easy it was to fall prey to a world where microscopic enemies reigned supreme and survival was a desperate struggle against overwhelming odds. As we look back, the medieval plague underscores not only the fragility of human life, but also the profound progress made since. Today's scientific advances have transformed what was an unstoppable killer into a treatable disease. Understanding the horrors endured by those in the past enriches our appreciation for modern medicine and the value of knowledge. It also serves as a cautionary tale about complacency in the face of infectious threats. The plague was more than a disease. It was a force that reshaped the course of history and humbled humanity's sense of control. The victims did not know why they fell ill or how to protect themselves. Their suffering was a stark testament to the power of disease in shaping cultures and rewriting civilizations. To imagine surviving such an ordeal is to confront the limits of human resilience when faced with nature's deadliest secrets. This has been one part of a longer story. A story that reveals not just the facts of a grim past, but the lived experience of millions caught in the web of contagion, desperation, and loss. The medieval plague left scars not just on the flesh and bone of those who lived through it, but deep within the collective memory of generations who followed. To walk the streets back then was to walk a gauntlet of death. The lessons are clear. Survival depended on more than luck or faith. It required knowledge, community cooperation, sanitation, and medical advances far beyond the grasp of medieval societies. In the absence of these, the plague was a juggernaut, an unstoppable force that tore through families, towns, and entire regions with devastating efficiency. The world of the Middle Ages was an environment where, simply put, you would not survive a plague. As we continue exploring this phenomenon in the next parts, we will uncover how societies attempted to adapt, resist, and eventually move beyond such calamities. But for now, the somber truth stands unchanged. The medieval plague was a predator in a world without weapons. It was a nightmare writ large across history, one that claimed millions because the world was simply not prepared for a foe so deadly and so relentless. The stench of death hung in the air like a thick fog. Narrow streets of medieval towns were clogged with the sick and the dying. Homes once filled with laughter were now silent tombs, and the few able-bodied individuals fled or hid in fear. It is hard to truly grasp what it was like to live through a plague in the Middle Ages, because the experience is so far removed from our current understanding of medicine and society. The plague was a brutal equalizer. It did not discriminate based on status or wealth. Kings and peasants alike fell victim. But surviving was not just a matter of chance. It was shaped by factors that would seem alien to the modern mind. The day-to-day reality of the plague years was a relentless assault on the senses and the spirit. Bodies bloated and turned strange colors. Fleas and rats scurried unseen and carried the invisible killers. People would witness those they knew transform from healthy to grievously ill in a matter of days. The role of bacteria was completely misunderstood. The Black Death was caused by a bacterium carried by fleas that lived on black rats. This tiny creature was the perfect agent for spreading decay and death. Rats thrived in medieval cities because of poor sanitation. Garbage littered the streets. Food was stored in ways that invited infestation. People did not wash often enough to deter fleas from biting bare skin. Body lice were another common vector of infection. The idea that rats and fleas could be the harbingers of such doom was impossible to believe at the time. The symptoms of the disease were terrifyingly visible. The bubonic plague produced painful swelling of the lymph nodes called buboes. These would sometimes burst, oozing pus and blood. That alone could discourage even the bravest from seeking help. In some cases, the infection spread to the lungs, causing pneumonic plague. This form was even more contagious because it traveled in tiny droplets expelled by coughing. Anyone living close to someone infected with the pneumonic form had little chance of escape. Doctors and healers did their best with the knowledge they had. Protective clothing involved long robes soaked in aromatic herbs. Attached to these robes was a beaked mask filled with spices and flowers. The idea was that the sweet, strong smells would keep away the miasma, or bad air thought to cause disease. Of course, those masks could not stop fleas or bacteria. Treatments involved bloodletting, leeches, and root concoctions that did more harm than good. Many tried prayers and pilgrimage, hoping for divine mercy. Families faced horrifying choices every day. If one member fell ill, it often meant the entire household would be overwhelmed. Caregivers risked their own lives to tend to the sick, often without any protective measures. Isolation was a luxury few could afford. Medieval homes were small and shared by many. Quarantine measures, when enforced, were crude. Entire neighborhoods could be sealed off with guards to prevent movement. These measures were often too late or insufficient. Economic activity slowed to a near halt. Markets emptied. Craftspeople lost their apprentices. Fields went untilled. The sudden loss of so many workers brought entire regions to the brink of collapse. Food shortages began to develop, compounding the misery. Some communities attempted to impose hygiene rules, but these were rarely effective. Understanding about contagion was rudimentary at best. The psychological toll was immense. People saw their neighbors turn into corpses literally overnight. Fear and despair permeated every interaction. Many believed the plague was divine punishment for sins. This belief sometimes fueled violence and persecution. Minority groups such as Jewish communities faced brutal scapegoating. Mass graves were dug in every town. The dead were stacked together in the hope of burying them quickly to prevent further spread. Religious institutions were overwhelmed as well. Priests administered last rites feverishly. Churchyards overflowed. The spiritual comfort once offered by sacred places was overshadowed by the terrifying reality that no one was safe. In the chaos, folk practices and superstitions grew stronger. Some believed that wearing certain charms or performing specific rituals would protect against the disease. Others sought out miracle cures or magical talismans. The social fabric itself was torn apart. Fear eroded trust. Neighbor distrusted neighbor. Communities fractured as people fled whenever possible. Survivors often suffered lasting stigma, suspected of harboring the plague or being cursed. Widows and orphans were left vulnerable without support. Traditional authority figures struggled to maintain order amid the mass mortality. The medical response was chaotic, but also motivated by desperation. Attempts were made to cleanse cities by burning infected houses or applying vinegar solutions on streets. Some cities erected plague walls to keep outsiders from entering. Physicians experimented with blistering agents or cauterizing wounds to drive out evil spirits. The lack of germ theory meant all manner of unfruitful remedies proliferated. Without understanding the true cause, prevention was nearly impossible. Yet all was not lost. The plague acted as a brutal teacher. Over time, certain practices laid the groundwork for future public health efforts. The idea of isolating the sick and restricting movement during outbreaks gained foothold. Burial regulations changed to prevent exposure of the living. Public health boards were created in some regions to coordinate responses. Though these measures were primitive, they showed early recognition of the need to control an invisible enemy. Medieval culture also reflected the presence of the plague in art, literature, and music. Morality plays and poems explored themes of death and the fragility of life. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became popular imagery, reminding people that all were equal before mortality. These expressions provided a way to process the trauma, even if they could not prevent it. To walk the streets in medieval times during a major plague was to embody peril. The ordinary acts of kindness or gathering for celebration were overshadowed by the looming threat. A simple cough could mean the end. The primitive understanding of hygiene and transmission sealed many fates. The combined effect of poverty, malnutrition, and overcrowding created a deadly environment for disease to explode. Survival was extraordinarily rare and often the result of pure luck or simple absence from contact rather than any deliberate protection. If one were suddenly transported into that world without knowledge, modern medicine, or understanding of germs, the chances of surviving the plague would be slim indeed. Even the best efforts by medieval doctors could do nothing to stop the rapid progress of infection. Towns became ghostly echoes of life snuffed out. Whole regions were depopulated, reshaping history itself. The horror of the medieval plague reveals not only the fragility of life, but also the staggering progress humanity has made in overcoming disease. Today, with antibiotics and vaccines, we can fight infections that once meant guaranteed death. Yet the memory of those dark centuries remains a chilling reminder. The plague was a force that swept across Europe and beyond without mercy, leaving few untouched. To survive in that time required more than strength, it demanded a resistance beyond praise. The story of the medieval plague is also a cautionary tale. It shows how human societies, faced with an invisible killer, struggled to adapt with limited knowledge and resources. It prompts reflection on the importance of public health, sanitation, and scientific understanding. The plague centuries ago was a monstrous event that shaped the trajectory of human development by forcing long overdue changes in how people thought about disease and contagion. In that world, death was constant and close. The plague demanded surrender from nearly everyone it touched. Few could resist its grasp. The tragedy was monumental, the suffering unimaginable. And yet life endured. Communities rebuilt. Knowledge slowly spread. From the devastation came lessons that would eventually save millions in the centuries ahead. But in the moment, in the streets roiling with rats and whispers of death, survival was a brief and rare miracle. That is why you would not survive a medieval plague. The plague, in all its terrifying efficiency, did not discriminate simply by wealth or status. Despite the assumptions that nobles enjoyed safer lives behind castle walls, or that monks in their isolated monasteries were shielded from the sickening tide, the medieval plague recognized no boundaries. The crowded, unsanitary conditions of towns and cities became breeding grounds for the deadly pathogen. Yet even rural populations thought to be far from urban centres were not spared. The very fabric of medieval life was vulnerable in ways few understood. The reality was that the bacteria Yersinia pestis, the agent responsible for the plague, had associations with tiny, often unseen vectors. Fleas, carried by the ubiquitous black rat, thrived in conditions created by human habits and environments. These rats infested ships that carried goods from the east as much as they infested the straw-filled floors of homes and granaries. When the flea-bitten infected rat or human, it ingested the bacteria. Inside its gut, Yersinia pestis blocked the normal digestive process. Driven by starvation, the flea would plague bite repeatedly and more aggressively, transmitting the bacteria with each feed. This microscopic interaction was a linchpin in the spread of plague across medieval Europe. It was not merely a disease caught by proximity alone, but one caught through the complex ecology of human behavior, commerce, and unsanitary living conditions. Those who might have assumed safety in their routine habits probably had no inkling of the bacterial mechanics at play. The plague was merciless, not only because it caused death, but because it dismantled the confidence people had in their own understanding of health, hygiene, and disease. People lived in ignorance of germs and how contagion moved. The concept of bacteria did not exist. Instead, victims and communities attributed causes to miasma, bad air, or divine punishment. These interpretations delayed effective responses and sometimes even worsened the spread. People fled their homes at the first symptoms. They abandoned family members or sought refuge in churches, which gathered many together in close quarters. Physicians, constrained by limited medical knowledge, often worsened outcomes. Treatments ranged from bloodletting to the application of poultices. These methods did nothing to stem the bacterial onslaught. Even the famous plague doctors, recognizable by their bird-like masks stuffed with herbs, lacked any weapons to fight the infection. These masks were attempts to filter bad air according to contemporary beliefs, but the wearer's safety was illusory. One might imagine that surviving a medieval plague required luck as much as anything else. Yet several factors defined who succumbed and who managed to live through. Immunity was not understood, but today we recognize that prior exposure could sometimes confer resistance. However, during the initial outbreaks, entire populations were immunologically naive. Without any inherited resistance or vaccines, no segment of society was truly safe. Those already weakened by malnutrition, chronic illness, or stress stood little chance. The relentless cycle of famine brought on by war, poor harvests, and political strife only worsened the situation. An individual living in a time of scarcity was defenseless against a swift killer disease. The plague could kill within days. High fevers, extreme swelling of lymph nodes known as buboes, and the sudden onset of chills and delirium were common markers. Many died before any care could be administered. The speed and unpredictability of the disease made panic widespread. Furthermore, the plague's impact reached far beyond individual mortality. Entire villages were wiped out. Trade routes faltered as merchants and sailors either died or abandoned their posts. Farmers left fields uncultivated. This cascading disruption drove famine and social upheaval. Fear bred suspicion and violence. Accusations fell upon marginalized groups such as Jews, who suffered horrific persecutions. These scapegoats had no relationship with the pestilence, but were nonetheless targeted because fear needs a focus and explanations, however false, to assuage despair. The social fabric of the medieval world pulled taut and snapped in places. Communities became more fractious and isolated. The economy reeled under labor shortages and disrupted production. Wages rose in some areas due to scarcity of workers. Rigid feudal structures began to falter in the face of these demographic shocks. In this way, the plague was not only a biological catastrophe, but a transformative one on society itself. The physical symptoms of the plague were dreadfully frightening and mercilessly efficient killers. Septicemic plague, a form where bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, often left victims dying within a day or two. The body's circulatory system would collapse. Hemorrhages under the skin caused blackening and purplish blotches, inspiring one of the plague's most infamous names, the Black Death. Pneumonic plague attacked the lungs and was directly transmissible between humans through droplets, increasing its danger. This form could decimate entire households swiftly, making isolation a challenge in cramped medieval dwellings. Those who recognized the signs limited contact as best they could, but rarely understood the contagious nature fully. Quarantine practices occasionally arose in port cities, laying the groundwork for public health measures that would develop centuries later. Still, in the heart of medieval Europe, knowledge lagged far behind the unfolding crisis. Rendering an image of what surviving meant is grim. Even those who overcame initial bouts might carry long-term damage. Secondary infections, damage to internal organs, and weakened health could shatter someone's ability to return to a normal life. Childbirth became riskier as maternal mortality coincided with the plague's ravages. Survivors often faced social stigma or ostracism, regarded as carriers or tainted by association. In this stark reality, the notion of survival extended beyond mere physical continuation. It involved navigating a world transformed into a perilous landscape filled with fear, loss, and uncertainty. The broader medieval world was ill-equipped to handle such plagues on a medical or social level. Hospitals as we know them did not exist. Care was often given in monasteries or by untrained family members. Medicine was intertwined with superstition and religion rather than science. Prayers, relics, and rituals accompanied whatever meager treatments were attempted. Medical texts of the time included recommendations to avoid foul air or to carry herbs and spices to counteract supposed poisons. While commendable in their intentions, none addressed the bacterial cause, and their effectiveness was largely symbolic. The idea of contagion was contentious. Some resisted the notion that disease passed from person to person, fearing the social consequences. Others were simply unable to translate observations into practical measures. Personal hygiene was minimal by today's standards. Bathing was not a widespread practice, and clothes were infrequently changed or washed. This environment was a boon for fleas and rats. The standard medieval diet, often heavy in bread and lacking in fresh nutrients, contributed to poor general health. Nutritional deficiencies made the population susceptible to a range of illnesses beyond plague, compounding the mortality toll. The cycle of poverty, disease, and death was intricately connected. Without a modern understanding of sanitation and public health, medieval societies were trapped in this deadly loop. Transport and trade increases during the High Middle Ages inadvertently aided in the rapid spread of plague. Ships brought goods across long distances, but also carried rats and fleas into new ports. Urban centres connected by roads and rivers became nodes for transmission. Markets thrived, but amassed crowds ripe for infective spread. The interconnectedness of late medieval Europe, though advancing civilization, accelerated the advancement of this catastrophe. The idea that distant lands might affect local health was new and terrifying. Plague outbreaks were often followed by waves of fear-driven responses like travel bans, city closures, or persecution. Yet none of these could halt the invisible spread until natural exhaustion of susceptible hosts limited the bacteria's ability to propagate. Understanding why you would not survive a medieval plague requires recognizing the convergence of these many factors that compound and overwhelm. The absence of immunity, the role of fleas and rats, the crowded and unsanitary living conditions, the lack of medical knowledge, poor nutrition, social upheaval, and misunderstood prevention created a perfect storm. Even if a person understood precaution, the tools needed to effectively implement them simply did not exist. The occasional quarantines were rudimentary and inconsistently applied. The rapid disease progression meant that many sick died before they could be isolated. In many cases, those tasked with caring or burying the dead contracted the disease themselves. Survival could hinge on speed and fortune more than any skillful defense. The psychological effect of plague was just as profound as the physical one. People faced the collapse of normal life. Entire families were extinguished. Religious belief was shaken. Anxiety and depression took root on a mass scale. The social order fractured under the strain. With so much death and loss, the future itself seemed uncertain. Yet from this dark period emerged shifts in culture, thought, and structure that would set the stage for the Renaissance and modernity. The human story is one of resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. However, the harsh truth remains that if you lived in a medieval town or city during a plague outbreak, your chances of survival were slim. The plague was an indiscriminate harvester, indifferent to your status or resolve. In essence, the medieval plague was a perfect storm of biology, environment, and human society's limitations. It capitalized on crowded towns, poor hygiene, ignorance, and interconnected trade. Its speed and lethality left communities stunned. Victim suffering was profound and multifaceted. Aid was scarce and understanding was wanting. The organism behind the plague was a microscopic agent wielding a deadly influence shaped by fleas, rats, and human crowds. Those who lived through it did so against overwhelming odds. No strategy, no matter how clever, could guarantee safety. The plague was a grim reminder of the fragile hold humans had on health in the medieval world and the devastating power of unseen enemies. A glimpse back at this dark chapter in history reveals the harsh and unforgiving landscape of medieval life under the shadow of the Black Death. It offers a stark lesson in vulnerability, a reminder that even in an age of superstition and early science, the forces of nature were often beyond control. You would not have survived the plague simply because the convergence of deadly biology and human circumstances created an insurmountable barrier. It was a battle largely lost before it even began, against an enemy invisible yet devastatingly real. Understanding this historical reality deepens appreciation for the advances in medicine, hygiene, and public health that shield us today. It also honors those who lived, suffered, and died when survival was a rare and precious gift. The night descends upon a medieval village gripped in shadow and silence. It is not just the absence of light that cloaks the narrow, muddy streets. It is a silence born of dread and despair. Those who remain hide behind shuttered windows and bolted doors, but the walls themselves seem to breathe the quiet shiver of death. This is no ordinary hardship. It is plague, the cruel visitor whose name alone instills terror and hopelessness. Under the faint glow of a waning moon, a body lies motionless next to a broken wheelbarrow. The skin around the neck is mottled with dark, bruised blotches. Farmers, tradesmen, mothers, and children walk the edge of life. Not one in this village faces the future with certainty. Instead, each breath marks a duel against an invisible enemy whose power dwarfs the strength of armies and kings. You would not survive here. It is not due to a single cause, but a relentless convergence of factors that shape the grim reality. Disease itself is an unforgiving master. The bacterium Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas that infest black rats, thrives in these conditions. The rats swarm within walls, in grain stores, and among refuse piled along the roads. As the fleas seek new hosts, they latch onto humans exposed by the crowded, unsanitary environment of medieval towns. The fleas inject their deadly cargo directly into the bloodstream with each bite, and the plague begins its ruthless advance within the human body. Once infected, the incubation period can be distressingly brief. Between 1 to 7 days, but often in a matter of mere days, the individual experiences the first symptoms. Fever spikes, chills convulse the flesh, and intense headaches hammer relentlessly. The lymph nodes, especially around the groin, armpits and neck, balloon into grotesque, painful swellings called buboes. These swellings can grow to the size of eggs or even oranges. When they burst, the smell is unbearable, and the wound becomes a highway for further infection. This form of the disease, known as bubonic plague, is just one among several. There is also pneumonic plague, where the lungs become ravaged by infection. In this form, the airborne droplets exhaled by the sick can infect others with terrifying speed. Pneumonic plague is even deadlier because it can pass from person to person without the necessity of a flea or rat. It enters through the respiratory system and transforms the lungs into a battleground of fluid and decay. Those infected cough violently, spewing infectious material into the air. Death can follow in a matter of days or even hours. The third lethal form is septicemic plague. When the bacteria invade the bloodstream unchecked, it leads to septic shock. The skin blackens as tissues die. The sufferer experiences delirium, followed in many cases by death so rapid it defies the grasp of hope or aid. These manifestations are brutal and swift. Survivors, if any, were rare and often left weakened, disfigured, or permanently changed in their health. Imagine the world before antibiotics or any understanding of microbiology. People believed the causes of plague to be foul air, bad odors, or angry spirits. The miasma theory prevailed with grave consequences. Without knowing how the disease spread or how to protect themselves, people panicked yet felt powerless. Some turned to religious fervor, processions, or self-flagellation in attempts to appease divine wrath. Others locked their doors and hoped the invisible menace would pass by. Hospitals were workplaces of sorrow rather than cure. They often doubled as quarantine centers for the infected. Doctors wore masks stuffed with herbs to combat the miasmas but had no treatment. The plague doctors beaked masks with aromatic substances, created a facade of defense, yet failed to stop infection. Their role was more of witness and recorder rather than healer. Once someone showed symptoms, the chances of survival were slim. Daily life exacerbated the reach of plague. Villages and cities were crowded and filthy. Waste was dumped into streets without sanitation systems. Water sources were easily contaminated. Rodents were a constant nuisance in marketplaces and homes. People rarely bathed. The knowledge of germ theory was centuries away. Even basic hygiene was unknown or unpracticed. Food shortages and malnutrition weakened the average person's body. Starvation or poor diet meant a weakened immune system, ready prey for the plague bacterium. Wars and social turmoil fragmented entire regions, leaving refugees, armies, and abandoned lands. Such conditions provided perfect breeding grounds for disease. Migration spread the infection as fleeing populations unknowingly carried fleas or carried it through trade routes by contaminated goods. The plague's impact on society was more than just the toll of lives. Trade suffered as merchants feared contagion. Fields went untilled as labourers perished. Families were broken beyond repair. Orphans roamed streets searching for lost kin. Entire villages were abandoned, their silence stretching for years. The social fabric strained under paranoia and mistrust. Some accused neighbours of witchcraft or deliberate poisoning. Jewish communities tragically became scapegoats, leading to violent persecution. Government and religious leaders struggled to respond amid the chaos. Measures to isolate the sick were inconsistent or ignored. Some cities imposed quarantines on ships or travellers, but enforcement varied widely. Communication and transportation limits delayed knowledge and intervention. Unlike modern viruses tracked daily by global health bodies, plague outbreaks could ignite dark and far-flung fires of death without warning. The psychological torment was another dimension of the plague's cruelty. Witnessing the sudden, painful deaths of friends and family etched despair into the collective consciousness. Faith wavered. Questions about justice and divine favor flooded thoughts. Art and literature reflected the preoccupation with mortality. Dance of death motifs reminded all that none escaped the reach of pestilence. Morbid fascination mixed with hysteria, branding the age with a shadow of doom. Imagine trying to care for the sick. Protective materials were absent or ineffective. Fear of contagion meant many caretakers abandoned their charges. Yet the sick had no escape from the cycle of infection surrounding them. Burial was often hasty and brutal. Mass graves replaced ransomed funerals. Bodies piled like cordwood in plague pits. The ground itself became infected, cursed by proximity to so much death. In towns, the soundscape changed. Where once children played and market criers shouted, now silence or anguished cries filled the air. The omnipresence of death was a mute witness. The disease knew no mercy. It struck rich and poor alike, high-ranking officials and peasants with similar indiscriminate force. It was impartial and absolute in its devastation. Medical knowledge was primitive. Treatments ranged from bloodletting to bizarre concoctions. Leeches were applied to bleed bad humours. Hot poultices or boiling water might be poured onto buboes. Some attempted the use of aromatic herbs or spices to cleanse the body. None had any real effect on the bacteria. The only respite was isolation and the hope that the patient's immune system could fight off the infection unaided. The days turned into weeks with bodies accumulating. Entire measures of human resilience failed. The concept of quarantine was rudimentary at best. Isolation helped, but was often ignored or impossible in cramped quarters. Villagers fled or died where they stood. The air itself seemed heavy and tainted with 1,000 unspoken deaths. In this scenario, survival was often a matter of chance rather than skill or courage. The disease was efficient and merciless. An infected flea bite or inhaled droplet could decide life or death in a matter of hours. The human body was vulnerable in unimagined ways. The defenses of the medieval world religion, superstition, primitive medicine were powerless against this microscopic foe. You would not survive because everything that made life possible was working against you. The lack of hygiene, the proximity to rats and fleas, the absence of medical knowledge, the crowded, disease-ridden environment left no margin for error. Food scarcity and immune weakness lowered natural defenses. Fear and isolation broke social structures and survival strategies. The plague did not discriminate, but it left no survivors behind unchanged. For those few who endured, their survival was a testament to raw luck mingled with a stubborn will to live. Many carried the scars of the ordeal, both physical and psychological, as a reminder of how fragile existence was. This reality stands in stark contrast to modern times, where antibiotics and public health measures keep such diseases at bay, at least in the developed world. We can now understand the mechanisms, treat infections, and isolate outbreaks before they claim so many lives. The medieval world offered none of these advantages. To place yourself in the center of a medieval plague outbreak is to confront a brutal lesson in vulnerability. You face a swift and merciless enemy invisible to the eye. No screaming battle cries or weapons can repel it. Each breath could be your last in a world where every defense is overwhelmed. The very nature of medieval life made survival improbable. The disease preyed upon the conditions their social and technological level created and perpetuated. It was a perfect storm of human frailty, ignorance, and environmental factors converging in endless fatalities. In this storm, even the strongest or most pious stood little chance. The plague was not a myth or distant history. It swept through generations, shaping the course of nations and families alike. The echoes of its devastation remain etched deep into human memory. This is why you would not survive a medieval plague. Not because of lack of willpower, but because the weapons you carry, knowledge, medicine, hygiene, were not born yet. The truth of this grim reality is perhaps the most sobering aspect of all. The plague was an equalizer and a monster beyond comprehension. It stole fathers and mothers, children and kings. It shattered communities and economies. It challenged beliefs and altered the course of history. Its legacy became woven into the fabric of medieval existence. And yet, hidden in this dark chapter of humanity is the slow birth of change. From the ashes of pandemics came a yearning for knowledge, for better hygiene, for medical advancement. The horrors witnessed pushed the boundaries of understanding and eventually gave rise to the slow unraveling of plague's dominion. But in those moments, in that village, in that night, shrouded in shadow and silence, the plague ruled supreme without mercy. It was a predator without face, a curse without relief. To stand there, to breathe that air, to live through that terror was for most an impossible feat. Survival demanded more than strength or faith. It demanded the invisible tools of science, sanitation, and medicine that the medieval world had yet to conceive. Until then, the plague remained a dark spectre of death haunting every corner of life and history. This truth is not mere sensationalism. It is a stark reminder that disease has shaped the human story in ways both seen and unseen. It is why the past is so vital to remember. To understand the plague is to understand a time when survival was a gamble against forces beyond control. In the face of medieval plague, survival was not a promise, it was a miracle. And those who lived through it lived forever under the shadow of a terror that could neither be seen nor fought with swords or shields. This is why you would not survive a medieval plague, because the world of that time held no answers and no mercy to an enemy that was relentless, invisible, and deadly beyond reckoning. The medieval plague was not simply an epidemic that came and went. It was a relentless force of nature that reshaped societies, terrified populations, and redefined the very idea of survival. In its grip, survival depended on a cruel kind of luck and unknowable variables. The disease moved faster than understanding, cutting down entire villages before anyone could react. Medical knowledge that might have helped was absent or misguided. Treatments were born of superstition or fear, often doing more harm than good. People turned to anything they could grasp for hope, whether prayers, charms, or purging remedies, but none could halt the invisible enemy. Beyond the physical affliction, the social fabric crumbled. Contact with the sick spread infection, yet isolation was nearly impossible in crowded towns and market squares. Clean water was scarce and sanitation non-existent. Fleas and rats thrived in these conditions, traveling between humans as carriers of the deadly bacteria. One infected flea was all it took to start another chain of suffering. In such an environment, diseases like the plague thrived. The human body was defenseless against such an onslaught without antibiotics or vaccines to combat it. Those who succumbed to the plague often did so painfully and quickly. Buboes, fever, delirium, and internal hemorrhaging reduced life to a desperate struggle. The sheer scale of death overwhelmed the living's ability to manage the dead properly. Mass graves absorbed the bodies, and fear of infection created isolation and suspicion. Entire communities were devastated and sometimes wiped from the map. Ultimately, the medieval plague serves as a stark reminder of how vulnerable humanity once was to unseen threats. It highlights the critical importance of modern medicine and public health infrastructure. The lessons it left behind inspired advances in hygiene, quarantine methods, and scientific inquiry. Today we stand far better equipped to face pandemics because of the horrors endured centuries ago. Looking back, it is clear why you would not survive a medieval plague. It was a perfect storm of biological threat, social conditions, and lack of knowledge. The plague was an unstoppable force in its time. Yet by understanding that dark chapter, we honour those lives lost and continue to build a future where such a fate is no longer inevitable. This is what history offers us: warning, wisdom, and hope